Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. We have over 170 people signed up, so I think more people will be coming into the room. It's such an honor to have Dr. Evan Stark here. And we are recording this event, so please be sure to take necessary precautions if anonymity is necessary. Turn off your cameras if you'd like to. And by Wednesday of this week, those registered, I will send a link out to so that you can view this recording again. If you know anyone who might be interested, please have them go in and register on Eventbrite until 10 p.m. tomorrow night so that way I can get this link out to everyone. I want to send a huge thank you out to my two MSW student interns who are here monitoring the chat for me, Lexi Tudiska and Katie Lupia. Thank you very much, lovely ladies. I'm so glad to have you here. And I guess that's it. So please keep yourself on mute. Please post questions into the chat. All questions for Dr. Stark will come through the chat at about 9:40. I will give about a 5-minute warning at about 9:35, and then maybe we can answer some questions. If you have the book, it is profound and dense and amazing. And Dr. Stark has a coupon that we will be putting in the chat for you. You can get a 30% discount on the book from Oxford University Press. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. So finally, I did want to mention my good friend, Dr. Lisa Fontes, and I are collaborating. She'll be here today, and we're collaborating on a clinician training and an expert witness training because you guys are here because you all know we need more allies doing this work, more people who understand it and want very badly to be able to support our children in these circumstances of being coercively controlled. And so if you know anybody who's interested in that, please head over to my website. There'll be information there. And then finally, welcome, Dr. Stark. I'm so grateful to have you here. As many of you know, Dr. Stark is my mentor, and he was on my doctoral committee, and I am so honored to know him. And he only lives 45 minutes away from me in the same state, so I'm lucky. So Dr. Stark, please, thank you so much for being here. You are a renowned expert, and you have been propelling this term coercive control in such a way that now more and more people are using it when they're describing the underpinning of domestic abuse. But this book really pivots and talks about the experiences, particularly of children, which is something new that a lot of people are not as adept at recognizing, certainly in the systems. And so that's why this book is so important. Your work, and of course, Dr. Emma Katz's work, has been profound in seeing children as victims. So I wanted to ask you a few questions. I'm going to put them out there, and then I'll leave it to you to tell us a little bit more about yourself, but also to perhaps give us the responses to some of these questions. Can you please, for us, describe the coercive control of children and how you define that, and the experiences of children as secondary victims? That's a term that you use, and if you can explain that to us, that would be helpful. What can you tell us about your experiences? You give so many research, forensic interviews you've done throughout the years about the correlation between domestic abuse or domestic violence and children in these family systems and their risk factors. And then I think ideally, what now? How can we use this information to really begin to shift the paradigm, the way that we need to shift the paradigm? So again, thank you so much. I'm so honored you're here.
Thanks, Chris. I don't know if I can do all that in 45 minutes or so, but and I want to give a shout out to Christine and Lisa. It's great to have students of any kind, but to have this kind is a blessing. So it's wonderful. If the answers to your questions will come from reading the book, I also would suggest, for those of you who haven't, well, even if you have read the first edition of Coercive Control, there's a new edition out of Coercive Control. And if you can lift it, it's very heavy, but it's considerably longer. It has all new cases. It has an up-to-date account of the legislation, and it's revised in some very significant respects. So it's also called Coercive Control,
Pardon, it's not
and
getting
it's
here.
also available. And I also, Christine mentioned Emma Katz's book. I do want to give a shout out to her book, Children and Mothers' Lives, but also to another book, Coercive Control in the Criminal Law, by another one of my former proteges and colleagues, Cassandra Weiner, also a very, very up-to-date critical accounting of the law. Children, of course, of control of identifies coercive control of women as the most important cause and context of child abuse. Homicide outside a war zone. I describe violence, sexual abuse, intimidation, isolation, and control, the 5 control tactics to which women and children are subjected, as well as the main tactics used only on children. When children become surrogates or a scapegoat for the adult victim or enlisted as confederates in abuse. The policies I propose are that I would end child welfare as we know it. I would end child welfare policies that remove children from abusive mothers and provide support as well as early intervention to treat the trauma caused by ACEs. In other words, I would end early intervention by ACEs as well as child welfare. I would recast the response to child abuse within the coercive control policy framework, which is what they're doing in Scotland, in England, in South Wales, in Canada, and a number of other places. That includes stiff criminal penalties for coercive control and strict limits on the access of offending partners to women and children they have victimized. Virtually no access. Many countries and US states have incorporated coercive control into their legal protections for women and children, as you know. I hope my book further elevates the status of children's rights globally to liberty rights, to autonomy, dignity, and equality, as well as physical safety, hence to live as full persons. I want to say just parenthetically here, none of this work on coercive control is based on new evidence. All of the work on coercive control is based on the new position in which women and children find themselves with respect to the status of their rights worldwide. In other words, we can only take seriously, more seriously, harms that we hadn't noticed before in women and children's lives, not because we weren't aware of them, but because they didn't have standing on the global stage. I want that to be very clear to people who are here. It's not because we didn't know you were being harmed in the ways that you were being harmed or that your children were being harmed. It's that those ways of being harmed were not given value in the same way that other bodied persons and younger persons and older persons' bodies are given value. Buy the book, if only for the cases. Any discussion of coercive control without the cases is bare bone. What I'm doing now is bare bone. The cases convey children's voices by proxy where children have been killed, as well as the mix of cruelty, courage, oppression, and liberation that comprises their experience. The book also includes cases of what I call patriarchal mothering, where abused mothers harm their children. Here, too, I argue that the primary architect of coercive control is solely accountable for the harms inflicted, whatever moral responsibility others may share. My book on coercive control replaced the prevailing model of abuse as a domestic violence crime against women's physical integrity and safety with a model of abuse as a violation of women's equality. The premise of the book is that the fault lines in a model of domestic violence and child abuse are equally glaring. For example, in tracing children's risk from woman abuse primarily to their dangers of witnessing or being exposed to their mother's physical abuse, the domestic violence framework trivialized children's experience of direct harm, minimized the positive and strategic role of witnessing by children as well as others, and diminished children's claim to justice and redress for harms to dignity and autonomy, as well as to their physical safety. Millions of children are being subjected to the same coercive and controlling tactics as their mother, with the same intent and with the same consequence. Moreover, the response of even very young children to coercive control suggests they are affected and the children's senses are affected and actively engaged with their oppression, even when they appear to be passive bystanders. In other words, even children who don't appear to have any response at all talk eloquently about what they've experienced when given the chance to do it. Where children are present, coercive control must be treated as a global offense affecting all members of the household. And so far, we're just talking about children in the Mother's Day, but obviously, when we're talking about coercive control in a family setting, grandparents, babysitters, neighbors, police officers, social service workers, everyone who is in the matrix is affected by coercive control. And they have been brought in many, many cases. Once a child is selected as a target, the types of abuse deployed and the frequency, duration, and severity of the tactics deployed can be comparable to those deployed against a primary partner, particularly if in addition to or instead of being made a direct target of coercive control, children are used as witnesses, couriers, spies, surrogates, and comrades in arms. Because children are secondary victims, however, and may only be directly harmed as a surrogate or proxy for the primary victim after a couple has separated, the risk the abuser poses to the child may not become visible until his final act to punish her. I have several cases in the book where my client's husband killed their child on a visitation that was court-ordered with a supervisor standing there. It was his first act of violence against the child. He had a picture of his wallet, of the child in his wallet when he drowned himself and the child. He killed the child. The first act of violence was killing the child, yet that child was victim of coercive control throughout the entire relationship when we went before the family court judge months earlier in Connecticut. But the child is a secondary victim because that man had no desire to kill the child. He had no animosity toward the child. His only animosity was towards his wife. The child was purely secondary, and the judge could not understand that. I said, Your Honor, he has nothing against his child, but that child is at risk as if he had a gun to his head. That's what calling it secondary means. It doesn't mean the child's victimization is secondary in importance. Quite the contrary. It means that if we want to understand the importance of the child as a victim, we have to understand the primary motive for the coercive control in the first place. That's one of the most difficult things to understand about this book. Our cases repeatedly illustrate that children are often and unexpectedly harmed or murdered by their abusers without warning because their primary animosity lies elsewhere. Recognizing the secondary role of child abuse in the criminal logic of coercive control is critical to protecting children. And I want to say some few things about how my approach to child abuse is new. The prevailing liberalism approaches child abuse as a social policy problem rooted in a combination of environmental and maternal deficits. That's what the child abuse literature is about. The current enlightened alternative, ACEs, is to prevent the effects of adverse childhood experiences through screening and early therapeutic intervention with children exposed to violence in their homes. Both the punitive and the early intervention models are premised on a false premise. And that premise is that the major childhood trauma associated with domestic violence, including physical and sexual and psychological abuse of children, are effects of circumscribed and time-limited events that can be elicited and managed distantly, apart from the events themselves. In other words, the idea of both child abuse intervention and of ACEs is that the child's trauma of witnessing is a fixed time event. It's not an ongoing course of conduct intrusive in the everyday life of people. And you can separate out the trauma and the child from that event. Or you can pull the child out of the home in the case of the welfare mothers, and you will somehow have removed the child from coercive control. I'll come back in a minute to that. The book argues that domestic violence, child abuse, and child sexual abuse are not experienced by children primarily as trauma, but rather in the vast majority of instances are experienced along a myriad of other harms, insults, and constraints as facets of an ongoing and predatory pattern of coercion and control that jeopardizes their rights, their dignity, their liberty, and their psychological well-being as much as their physical health. And I propose to interrupt this course of conduct by targeting interventions to the mainly male partners and ex-partners responsible for coercive control, and neither at the supposedly immature or inadequate mothers, nor the children on whom current investments in child abuse prevention focus. Again, children are secondary victims of coercive control because the primary obstacle to an abuser's control over the household is their mother, not the child. I should say that the aim of coercive control, because there's an aim, it's not sexism, it's not, misogyny. It's to control all the resources and privileges and opportunities that are available through a family space and to hold them as one's own. And the primary obstacle to that is the woman. It may not be, it may be the grandparent, it may be somebody else, a third person, another person in the house. So that person will become an object of coercive control. Coercive control is not a gendered crime. It is gendered by the simple fact that because of sexual inequality, persistent sexual inequality, vast majority of resources in family spaces and personal space are disproportionately controlled by men and not women, and men can appropriate those resources. If we had full sexual equality, either coercive control would be an incidental phenomena or it would go away altogether. But so long as there's sexual inequality, coercive control is gendered by the disproportionate allocation of resources and opportunities in the household. Children are secondary victims because the primary obstacle to control of the household is the mother, not the child. This reflects the logic of victimization, not that the abuser's goal is to subdue the mother and garner privileges, not necessarily to hurt the children, and bear on the relative importance of interventions that protect children or hold abusers accountable. As numerous cases in my book illustrate, the men who pose the greatest risks to their children may harbor. I want to repeat this again and again because you have to tell it to the judges, you have to tell it to the family lawyers. The fact that the man does not hate your children, does not hate his children, or children generally, does not mean he's not forcibly controlling and won't kill them. The point is he has a commitment to appropriate resources by any means necessary, and they will do that, what he has to do that. My book also includes cases where children collude in their mother's abuse. Even when children collude in their mother's abuse, and I have a number of cases where that has happened. Teenagers, 9-year-olds, adult children, grown children, colluding in their mother's abuse. Even where that happens, I emphasize the protective role of their strategy rather than children's culpability. I'll say more about that if we have time. Children, now I'm going to say something about the evidence, where it comes from. Children, of course, in control starts from two widely replicated empirical realities. First, that the majority of child abuse takes place in the context of domestic violence. And secondly, that the vast majority of domestic violence incidents reported to shelters, hospitals, and police occur in the context of coercive control. A pattern where repeat, ongoing, but typically low-level physical abuse occurs in concert with a range of sexual offenses and tactics. I assume you know this by now about coercive control, that the typical violence in coercive control is not bone-breaking violence. It slaps, pushes, shoves, grabs. It's the accumulated weight of 1,000 cuts. The terrorism of being a prisoner in physical subjugation, the accumulated weight of the violence is what constitutes the weight on children's heads. Low-level physical, with a range of sexual offenses and tactics to denigrate, isolate, intimidate, and exploit and control female partners. The importance of domestic violence as a context for child abuse and child mortality had been recognized for decades. Following up on a pioneering study that my wife, Ann Flitcroft, did when she was a medical student at Yale for her medical thesis, she and I did a multi-year NIMH-funded study at Yale New Haven Hospital that showed that male partner violence was a major cause of women's injury, more common than all accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. It was an incredible finding at the time because no one had any idea. It was on any radar of any surgical or medical clinic in the world that women's injury was a major cause of violence. More common, and it was also a context for huge amounts of depression, alcoholism, all kinds of behavioral problems. Again, no one had ever looked at women's medical records and made the correlation with domestic violence and that. The violence lasted an average of 5 years. So these abusive relationships were between 5 and 7 years. Violence wasn't just not an incident. It was not only repeated, but it was being repeated as a pattern for over 5 years. That told us something was wrong with our domestic violence model, but we didn't know yet what. It was a course of conduct. And this was in subsequent years confirmed by hundreds of studies. One part of our research, which was all I wanted to talk about tonight, was that one of the studies we did was a study of all the children at Yale New Haven Hospital who had been darted by their child abuse team. We looked at their mother's records, and we found out that vast majority of children who were darted for child abuse, and particularly for child abuse, but also for neglect, were themselves abused. We didn't have any other information on the men, but we were able, through a series of devices, to put together records, because at the time, the DART committee at Yale didn't keep any record of the father's name. The case was in the mother's name, even if she was dead. So there were no records of men in these records. So we were able to put together the records of the men from the records of the men who had abused the women, and we put together with the records of the children, and found out that the majority of the children who were abused in the child abuse, but recorded by the child abuse team at Yale, were being abused by the same men who were abusing their mothers, even though they were not being identified. Not one man was identified at the time. These children were being referred to child welfare, and that was the discovery that put domestic violence and child abuse on the map. That the domestic violence was the leading context in which children were being abused, and that the men who were abusing the mothers were also abusing the children. And that change, it had an incredible impact. There was lots of changes, and all the shelters throughout the country began to look at children in a different way, began to talk to Child Protective Services in a different way. Every Child Protective Service in the country began to develop domestic violence training. Family courts began to take domestic violence protocols. We had all kinds of committees and commissions. Basically, nothing changed. In 2004, I got a call from the city of New York that they were being sued by a friend of mine and a group of mothers because their children were being taken away by the child welfare system and put into foster care, and the mothers were being charged with neglect. And the research on which they were basing these removals was Dr. Stark's research and Dr. Flickcraft's research at Yale. Because we had shown that domestic violence was a risk factor for child abuse, and they were identifying these women as victims of domestic violence, since they had no protocols for managing or even seeing men. They simply removed the children, put them in foster care, cited the women for neglect as the basis for that. So we obviously told New York, which is the largest welfare agency, the largest public agency in the world, we sued them, and we had months of trial, hundreds of witnesses. I was the lead expert for the plaintiff mothers, Mrs. Nicholson. And to make a long story short, they came down with a decision in Nicholson versus Williams that said it was unconstitutional to take children away from mothers solely because the mothers were abused. That more than that, it was unconstitutional to put their children in foster care. For the first time in American law, children were recognized as having a Fifth Amendment right, a Third Amendment right, a Ninth Amendment right against indentured slavery. They were seen as having all the rights that adults had, not to be taken away for unjust cause and taken away from their mothers and put into slavery. And he said this was unconstitutional. So the mothers got their kids back, and everything was supposed to be hunky-dory. But of course, very little changed after that, and the reason very little changed was because still there was nobody doing anything about the men. There was still nothing that was on the table that said, well, if this domestic violence didn't just happen in the family, what made it happen? And who was making it happen? And what could we do about that? Well, that's where coercive control came in. Because basically, and I should say, another thing that really struck us about the child abuse research was that the highest risk to children was not to children from married women, but the highest risk to children was to women who were separated, single, and divorced. That told me something that we had never understood before about domestic violence. That domestic violence is not about what happens in families and in couples. That domestic violence crosses social space. That word may not mean anything to those of you who are not sociologists, but crosses social space means that when a crime like stalking, when a crime like robbery, when a crime like satellite imagery, can get into your house from another place. That crosses social space. It means that a woman and child are not safe in their house just because the abuser is not in the house. If the abuser has a mechanism, which these abusers obviously have, not only to be violent against children of women from whom they're single, separate, and divorced, but to be violent against the women themselves, even though they're at a distal point, then we're talking about a criminal pattern. Remember, we know already it's ongoing, lasts for 5 to 7 years, a criminal pattern that continues to exist when couples are separated in social space. And that's what got us thinking about coercive control. And then we went back to the drawing board and we started interviewing women and we started interviewing children. The first woman I had ever interviewed that we hid in our house, a woman named Donna, told me when I asked her, violence wasn't the worst part. And I told her, talk about the violence. Now I went back to what Donna had told me, violence wasn't the worst part. When we started talking to women after women after women, listening to the stories they've been trying to tell us about all the physical abuse, the psychological abuse, the intimidation, the stalking, the sexual innuendos, all of the little ways, the multiple ways, and the whole constellation of coercion and control that they had described and that we had reduced to physical violence. In the ensuing decades, the findings at Yale were replicated by hundreds of studies and so forth and so on. But it took several decades before child welfare systems really took it up. And by 2006, when coercive control first came out, we were still struggling with the idea of what is this pattern of abuse that women are talking about. We still didn't have a coherent description. Coercive control involves a long-standing, and that's all it was based on. Coercive control was based on what women were telling us was going on in their lives and had been telling us for 50 years, but we hadn't been hearing it. It was what women had been telling the family court 50 years and was in lots in family court records. It was in criminal trials. Everywhere I looked, it was in novels, it was in autobiographies, it was in memoirs, it was in Netflix. The only place coercive control couldn't be found was in the social science and psychology and pediatric journals. Everywhere else, coercive control was visible. It involves a long-standing, spatially diffuse, a multifaceted pattern of abusive behavior designed to subordinate its targets, isolate them from sources of support, and exploit their capacities and appropriate their resources for personal gain. It is deployed, coercive control is in all kinds of relationships. And in many social settings other than abusive relationships. But the most devastating effects result when it builds on pre-existing sexual inequalities in families and relationships that further disadvantage women and children. You could have coercive control in gay relationships. You could have coercive control in corporate situations. I've had coercive control in Jehovah's Witnesses communities. I've seen coercive control in many different kinds of settings. But when it builds on pre-existing sexual inequalities in families and relationships to further disadvantage women and children, it is most insidious because these women and children are already disadvantaged by inequality. Because coercive control involves ongoing behavior that is multifaceted, self-serving, and always crosses social space to engage partner victims at multiple settings, it can be identified and interrupted. It is easy to identify coercive control. It does not happen behind closed doors, as we used to say, behind domestic violence. It happens at the office. It happens on the street. It happens at the pub. It happens at the supermarket. It happens at the gym. It happens at the school. It happens at the PTA meeting. It happens everywhere. People know about it. They may not know what they know until they're asked, but they know something is going on and something is wrong. And by asking and by putting police into these communities with their ears on the ground, looking for coercive control, it's amazing what they're able to find. It can be identified and can be interrupted. Its perpetrators can be apprehended, and the integrity and rights of victims can be restored. Protecting women and children by stopping coercive control is a matter of political will and justice resources. In 2018, Scotland became the first of several countries to identify child abuse as an element of a serious crime of coercive control. You get 14 years in prison if you expose a child to coercive control. Part 2 of my book describes the elements of such an offense, the coercive control of children. I'm not going to say anything about this because I don't have time, but the basic parameters of coercive control of children are exactly the same as the coercive control I described of women: violence, sexual abuse, isolation, intimidation, control. But I want to just say a few words in the short time that I have left, few minutes I have left, about the unique dynamics of coercive control with children. One is the selection of the target child as a scapegoat or a whipping boy who's punished as a surrogate for the adult victim, because often the adult victim is too high profile or is a position of public visibility to whom the abuser depends. In my book, I described a case, a New York City case I had, in which the father was a bank president and he took early retirement to write his memoirs, supposedly, of his childhood in Pakistan. His wife was a stockbroker on Wall Street, and he depended on her income. So, and his money was presumably tied up in overseas investments. So the family had to live off the mother's income. And to enforce his control over the woman of her assets, but leave no marks, he singled out the teenage son as a whipping boy. And he would simply beat the teenage son whenever he wanted to terrorize his wife. He'd smack the boy upside the head, he'd kick him around the room, he'd knock him off the ground, hold him off the balcony of their apartment, and stuff like that. And he got concessions from his wife. The judge didn't want to hear anything about his abuse because he had never touched her. And it was only during the trial when he conducted his first assault on his wife. In 23 years, he made his first assault on his wife, a near-fatal attack with a barbell, because she announced her intention to divorce. By then, both teenagers in the family had been medicated for depression and anxiety, and a school counselor had noticed a very wealthy family. You may have guessed. The school counselor had noticed trouble at home, but no one noticed that the children's restricted emotional vocabulary was the result of the general obliteration of liberty by the father in the home. I mean, this is a case where you don't see that in the coercive control of women, that kind of scapegoating. Another unique configuration is when the child becomes a surrogate for the abuser and is used as a weapon or collaborates in the mother's abuse, seemingly as an equal partner. These scenarios make it extremely challenging to treat children's victimization equally to women's, because there are children aligned with the abusive father and either directly participate in coercively controlling the mother or side with the abusive dad in the custody dispute. I don't know how many remember Knock Me Knock when I did that case here in Connecticut, but in Knock Me Knock, we had an 11-year-old Mariah Knock who testified that she had seen no violence. And the only evidence that I had was that my client had been abused. The only evidence I had that my client was abused was I had a 5-volume diary in Chinese. In the Calvin case, My clients wanted custody of 12-year-old Anna, who said that she preferred her father, though he found her mother's lifeless body in their apartment on New Year's Eve morning, shortly after he left, and he had witnessed many of his physical and sexual assaults on her. And not be knock, a note from the shelter state. She was, Mrs. Knock was staying at New Haven Battered Women's Shelter. In a note from the shelter stay, I was allowed to provide an evidence. Mariah Knock had told her mother, "I hope you die. I hope you die," seemingly voicing a sentiment she had witnessed her father express. And a lawyer for the father said, "See, she doesn't like her mother. This is where she gets this from." My special challenge in the Calvin case, which we lost initially, I won't go into that, and just want to know why, was a recent policy directive from New York. The lawyers for children were obliged to represent the wishes of the child rather than their best interest. Anna wanted to live with the man against whom she would be the sole witness. In both Knock and Calvin, I showed how a coercive control framework reconciled the dilemma posed when a child denies the mother's victimization by interpolating the girl's wishes as a rational adaptation, the extension of the father's abuse. For both Mariah Knock and Anna Calvin, supporting their abusive father was a defensive adaptation to his coercive control. Mariah Knox said, "I hope you die." I was able to explain that to the court. "I hope you die. I hope you die," because that's what he'd heard him tell her mother again and again when he made her sit and watch him humiliating her mother night after night. In the Calvin case, we did eventually win, but we won because he got custody. His parents got custody actually of Anna Calvin. And then he put out Anna Calvin to trafficking, sex trafficking. The parents finally woke up. His parents, they took the Anna away from him, and he was finally sentenced for the wife's murder in the beginning. But the point I'm making is that even in cases where the child specifically voices a desire that is hostile to the woman's belief and needs, that he's for the father or he's against the mother in some way, I still see the child as a victim of coercive control and go in and try to present to the court an explanation for why the child's hostility is an expression of his need for protection as a coercive control.
Dr. Stark, can we perhaps open up for a few questions at this
Sure.
time? Thank you. Thank you. Katie, do we have a question for Dr. Stark?
Yes, we
my
do.
screen, but you might have to read it to me.
Yes, we actually have been going through the chat and recording questions as they've been coming in. So we do have a couple lined up. Let me just pull up the document very quickly. All right, so our first question is, can the safe mother provide any support to prevent the impact? Court/laws are not moving fast enough to protect our children, and as mothers, judges are putting our children in danger, and there's nothing as mothers we can do. So what can mothers do to protect/support their children in situations where courts have ordered 50-50 joint physical and legal custody despite coercive and controlling behaviors of the father? If you need me to repeat any of that, let me know.
If I thought there was something we could do that would solve that problem, we would have done it. And we wouldn't need coercive control laws. I think the reason we need coercive control laws is because courts and judges, and I'm not even sure family courts can do it on their own without criminal backing. Family courts don't have the wherewithal to investigate, and they don't have the legal equipment to really implicate the many behaviors that are involved in coercive control. The best we can hope to do is to continue to bring cases after case, bring evidence of coercive control before the court, bring diaries, bring emails. The nice thing about coercive control, I have to say this, is that everybody knows. There's nobody who's involved in coercive control who's fooling anybody. every friend of this guy, every co-worker of his, every ex-girlfriend of his, every former wife of his, every child of his knows that he's a controlling SOB. They have history, they have experience with him, and that evidence needs to be collected. Your lawyer needs to believe it, because your lawyer may not believe it. And many lawyers do not believe it because they're so used to the idea, and they also don't understand how a strong woman, if you're strong, could be coercively controlled, and if you're not, how to win support from a court to see your strength come out. The answer is you can't be helped. Your desperation in your situation is exactly why we are getting coercive control laws on the books, and why we need to fight more and more strongly to bring children under the umbrella of coverage, to make it clear that what affects that the child is going to be used and controlled and manipulated in the same way. He doesn't preserve his venom for you, and he doesn't. And you have to stop thinking his venom is aimed at you. His venom is aimed at him. He wants privilege. He wants opportunity. He wants it all for himself. And everything will become grist for his mill, including the lawyers, including his friends, including his co-workers. And that kind of excessive power hungry stuff needs to be on the front burner. And you got 50-50 custody, that's 50 more than many of my clients are getting, were getting in the old days. Now we seem to be more successful in family court in some places in California where they're recognizing it. I don't know how these new coercive control laws are going to play out. I can't promise you. Where we can put a guy away for 14 years, as we can in Scotland, for behavior that he wouldn't be getting a slap on the hand on in family court in Connecticut or New Jersey, I can tell you we're going to do something, but I can't promise it anywhere else.
I think education, right, Dr. Stark? It's just like that's your book is about educating people and understanding that it truly is harmful to children. And the more that we can educate and let people know, and with legislation right now, I know people are frustrated. Sometimes the legislation doesn't feel like it's doing anything, or that it might be one step forward, two steps back, but we have to believe.
I'm going to say, I don't think it's education. I know you're an educator, so you believe in education. I don't believe we're educating ourselves. I believe we're learning. I believe we're becoming aware of our rights. And as we become aware that children have rights, we're going to see things that we didn't recognize as harmful to them as harms. I'm not saying anything about children that you can't watch any night on Netflix, and my 9-year-old can't get on. The only place you don't have a record of coercive control of children is in the pediatric and social work journals. Everywhere else on the media, you see children being degraded, shamed, insulted, beaten. The only difference is that we accept that, and now we are, in certain parts of the world, we're recognizing that's not acceptable. It's really, so it's not so much a question of learning about coercive control. It's a question of learning about dignity and learning the importance of extending to children the same respect and rights that we extend to others, and making clear in our public ways of dealing with them that we expect the same from the law courts and the police. I'm not saying you're wrong. You want to educate people, but laws are slow, but laws are not the answer.
Mhm.
Laws are only a very small part of gender equality, and they only signal what's up ahead in terms of real changes that need to take place. But no law is going to solve a problem that's rooted in the recognition of other people's humanity.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I have another question here. What does the research say? What can you say about the future of men who use coercive control? Do they get worse? Do these patterns escalate even when their children age out of the system? What have been some of your
Well,
experiences
children
with
or
the children?
men? What were you asking me about?
No, we're asking actually, this person's asking the future of the men who are the abusers. Like, does their behavior escalate with age, or what have
I
been?
don't think I don't think of coercive control as anything but a learned behavior. I don't think it's an instinct. I don't think it's embedded in you. I don't think it's. I mean, I've worked with men from all walks of life who were coercive controlling, from bank presidents and politicians to truck drivers, ex-Marines, guys who couldn't lift a barbell to men who could lift a truck with one arm. I mean, there's all types of people who men commit coercive control because they can. And because the privileges that are identified with ordinary life for most men make you feel like one of my mentors, when his wife got a job as a school teacher, and she came home and she made him dinner, he felt like a pig in shit. He said, "Doctor, I felt like a pig in shit. I could get somebody to do my wash, run my trucks, do my television, do my bank accounts." I mean, when he discovered that if he found out he could get that for nothing, and by squeezing the space out, he could do it, and he sees all around him that people can do it. Coercive control is a very common behavior. I don't know if you know this in politics, but there's a lot of people around who use this behavior. So I don't think there's no therapy, there's no cure. If you tell somebody they can't do it, they'll stop doing it. And if you make it clear that they can't do it because it won't be tolerated and they won't any longer be part of the society because they'll be removed from social converse, then they'll stop doing it. And I think the same thing is true for children. Children will learn that this kind of behavior is not acceptable, just as they learn to wear masks during COVID.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question someone put in the chat is, how can we as citizens, what would you, if you had the ideal situation, what would you want everyone in this forum today to do to support the experience, to support the prevention of
Besides buy
children?
my books, besides
Yes.
buy my books.
Yes.
Well, I think having a conversation with each other about what this new understanding of abuse means in terms of our everyday practice. Each one of us is involved in some way in a changed relationship with other agencies or organizations, I assume. And I think when we started out, we believed that it was physically wrong to hurt another person, and that physical violence was the wrong that we should be upset about with women. As women gained in equality and their dignity and their achievements and all those things got more and more obvious and transparent as what they were bringing into the world, we could see that the extent to which those liberties were being quashed was actually the essence of abuse, and that physical violence, a physical part, was a relatively small part of it. And so I think in terms of what people have to do in their daily lives is they have to look around them and see what parts of their lives are being quashed. Are we losing?
I have no idea. Looks like somebody opened their Zoom. One of our participants maybe opened their Zoom.
Yes, I am trying to mitigate the issue right now.
Thank you,
That's
Katie.
okay.
Yep.
Oh, no. Well, anyway, so what I'm just saying is I think you have to ask yourself, what is the realm of freedom and constraint within the sphere in which you're operating? The personal sphere, but also the social sphere. And how can you redefine what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior within that sphere within which you're operating? To what extent does it have to extend into law? To what extent does it have to extend into practice in your writing or your art? And to what extent does it reach out? because ultimately that's what coercive control is. Coercive control is a practice of liberty in a society in which opportunities for practicing liberty are being restricted. And so you try to define where is it that you can open it up. No amount of law is going to change that. But learning to have a conversation about not being abused took women a long time to recognize no one has a right to do that to me. Now we're talking about no one has a right to make me feel that way. No one has a right to make me do that. No one has a right to treat me that way or to disregard me that way. And as that conversation becomes part of our conversation with our children, I think we'll have a much better ground which to address a few among us who continue to restrict liberties and freedom through coercive control. You can't put everybody in jail who commits coercive control, but by example, you can spread the word that we can. I think in terms of our practice as in the shelter movement, the battered women's movement, well, we have to recognize we started out believing in this, and during COVID we did a little bit of this in Europe. We've defined now women's movement through space much more broadly than we had previously when we thought of shelter as a specific refuge. We're now moving women thousands of miles, and we're now beginning to recognize that the idea of women in space, women in social space, is a much more active conception of women's liberation than the idea of simply not being physically abused. So I think we're opening up on our shelter practice. It has to do with opening up spaces in the community rather than simply hiding people off in shelters. If we decide we don't want to put men in prison, what alternatives do we have to keep them out of the community so that the spaces in which women and children move are protected? Are we developing spaces which include men in providing ways that women can shop and can bowl and go to the movies and still be safe and free within their community so we don't have to have shelter? I mean, those are the things that we can all do with our practice with coercive control.
Giving people agency, ensuring that people understand they have a choice, right?
Let people make the choices they have, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I don't, I think we're just about out of time. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add, Dr. Stark?
No, they're good. I mean, and if this is what you want, this is what you got.
Well, I think we're all very grateful, and I think
it's late. It's late for me. It's past my Netflix time, but I think I would just say, but coercive control is one of the most exciting. Itself is a very bad concept. It's a clumsy idea. The word itself is not great, but the excitement that is bred when women in our movement have begun to think in a much more positive way about themselves, rather than think about themselves as victims, think about themselves, rather than themselves as victims, they think themselves as not yet fully equal. And that this has been put in there because men are coercively controlling women. And maybe that's the thing to leave you on. Men are coercively controlling women, not because of women, because of what women are not. Because women are not their mother, because women are not their girlfriend, because women are not good cooks. But men are coercively controlling women because they want what women are, because they want to take what women have and what women are becoming and what women want to be and make them theirs and make those things their own. And they wanted to do that with children because children are, more than anything else, the visions of women have of their future. And they want to possess that too. Men want to possess that part of women as well. So I think that to understand that, you have to understand that coercive control is a sign that equality matters, but more equality matters more. In other words, women are coercively controlled because they have they have more now than they've ever had before. They have jobs, they have money, they have time on their hands, they have skills, they have many, many things that women in my mother's generation even barely had. But they don't have full equality. And the solution to coercive control is full equality.
Absolutely. That is a wonderful way to end it.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Stark, so much for being here. Bravo. We appreciate your time. Oh, he's gone. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I appreciate it. You'll get a copy of this recording if you want to go back and listen to it. If you know anyone who might be interested who wasn't able to sign up, please have them do so before 10 p.m. tomorrow night, and I'll make sure that I can get the recording out to them. So, hopefully you heard something new. I think some of his research is, I mean, if you haven't read the book yet, it's quite startling and upsetting. You have to be able to put it down. He talks about some really horrifying cases that he has been a forensic evaluator on. But I think it's the beginning of, and I'm not trying to be snarky here, education. So I appreciate you being here. Let's all go back and talk to 10 people, 10 by 10, right?
Yep.
All right. Wonderful night. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Bye.